Chag Sameach, everyone. Chag Sameach. What? Sure. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody. We're glad to have you all here with us this evening. We're going to invite you all to please turn to page 1 in your. Please turn to page 1 in our Sidurim as Cantor Krasner leads us in the Mincha service. Page 1.
Ashrei Shevetecha Od Yalucha Sela
Ashrei Shekachalo, Ashrei Shadonai Eloham.
Ilale David Aramim Chalai HaMelech Vavarcha Shimcha Leolam Vaed
V'choyam avarchecha v'olal shimcha li'olam va'ed.
Donai Olam Meod V'lidlato in Cheker
V'olador yeshavach ma'asecha u'gvurotecha yagidu.
Hadar Kevorotecha V'tivei Niflotecha Asicha
V'ezuz nerotecha yomeru u'gulatcha asaprena.
Zecharav Tuchaya Bia V'tikat Chayir Anenu
Anun v'rachum Adonai erech alpaimu g'dol chesed.
Ovanai Lakov Rachama Vakom Asav
V'duch Adonai kol ma'asecha v'chasidecha yivarchucha.
Malchut Chayomeru, Ugvrat Chayidaberu,
V'hodil livnei hadam gurota v'chavod hadar malchuto.
Malchut Chamalchut Kolamim, Memshatecha V'chodor Vador,
Meich Adonai l'chol hanoflim v'zokef l'chol akfufim.
Einechoy Lecha Yisaberu, Ve'atanatin Lahem Elchlam B'ito,
Uteach et yadecha u'mazbil l'chol chai ratzon.
Sadik Anai V'chod Rachav, V'chasin V'chom Asav,
Arov Adonai l'chol karav l'chol asher hu v'yemet.
Son Re'av Ya'aseh, Ve'shavatam Yishma V'yoshiem,
V'meir Adonai kol ohavav v'yed kol arshaim yashmid.
Tilat Anai Berpi, V'reka Basar Shingachal Yalam Vahed,
V'anachnu nevarech ya mi'ata v'yad olam. Hallelujah. Please rise. The Chatzi Kaddish is followed by the Amidah, beginning on page 3. We'll join together in the Avot and Kedusha sections on 3 and 4, page 3 and page 4, concluding silently through page 9.
Yikadav Yikadash Merabah,
Amen.
Me'amad Yirach Yiruteh V'yalich Machuteh, B'chayechon V'mechon V'chaylecha B'Yisrael, B'galav V'zman Karivim Ru Amen.
Amen. Yehi Shmer Rabban V'rach Yivarach.
Amaya, Hiporach V'yishabach V'yipor V'yitzma V'naseh, V'yidar V'yitala V'yitalash V'godshah B'richo, Ilam Yikra V'chata V'yishua Tosh V'chata Nechmata D'amiran V'yamavim Ru Amen.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu v'avotenu, Eloi Avraham, Eloi Yitzchak, v'Eloi Yaakov, Ha'el HaGadol HaGibor v'Hara, El Yaakov HaChasim, Tovim Knei Yaakov, Zochei Chasdei Avot, V'Vigol Elei V'Nehem L'man Shema B'Yava, Melech Hoseh Moshe U'Magei, Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Avraham, Atah Gibor L'man Mechaim Etuat Rav Leoshia, Mechakel Chaim Mechesed, Mechaim Etim Rachamim Rabim, Somek Naflim Rofei Cholim, Matir Asurim, Mekayim Motot Shnei Afar, Mechamocha Ba'Gevrot, Midam Melach, Melach Mitim Chayim Matmech Yeshua, B'neman Atah Chayim Meitim, Baruch atah Adonai, Mechayim Meitim.
Amen. Nekadesh es kol kashem shmak tishur shmoram. Al yad v'yach v'krozel ze v'yamah.
Yikadish Shnicha B'Olam, Keshem Shmati Shim Otam B'Shmim Aram, Kratu V'yan V'yach V'krozel ze v'yamar.
Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot Melachot V'do.
Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot Melech Haaretz Kvodo, L'matam Baruch Yomeru.
Baruch Kavod Adonai Mimkomo.
Baruch Kavod Mimkomo, Divrei Kodshecha, Katuv Lemor.
Yiloch Adonai Le'olam, Elohai Yitzion L'Dovador, Hallelujah.
Yiloch Adonai Le'olam, Elohai Yitzion L'Dovador, Hallelujah. L'Tov Baruch Nagigad Lecha, Only Tzatzachin Kedushat Chanatish, Mashiach Elohim Piyam Mashlam Voed Kiyem Echel Kadoshata Baruch Atah Adonai
Oh.
Ha'el Kadosh.
Friends, we continue now with the Kaddish Shalem, followed by the Sing of Aleinu.
Yikra vikra shmer hapa.
Amen.
Yamad yirak yiruk te v'alich malchut te b'chaychon v'chon v'chaylecha b'Yisrael. Magalav izman karev v'yimeru.
Amen. Yehi Shmer Abba Barach. Yom Lom Yomaya Yitborach.
Yiporach v'yishabach v'yipoar v'yitwa v'yinaseh b'yitav v'yitalev v'yitala. Shmer kodesh abrichu. لا ميكا بخطاوش يرغب بخطانك ماتا دعمي روحان بيوما بيمروا
Amen.
تكبالت لو تهون بأوت تهون خليسا كلما بهون دميش مايا بيمروا آمين يهي شلام الرب من شما هيا بخايم عليهن بغليسا بيمروا
Amen.
أسا شلام يرمى ويسا شلام عليهن بغليسا بيمروا
Amen. Aleinu
Shabeach ladon hakol, latek gedola liyotzer bereshit, shelo asan goye haratzon, velo saman hagvish lechat adama, shelo samcha keinu kahem, v'kohor aleinu kechol hamonam, ואנחנו קוראים משחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. בתורתך נעים לך לעולם ועד
ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד. Mourners Kaddish. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei rabah v'yolma divrach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei v'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayei dechol beit Yisrael v'agala uv'izman kariv v'yimaru amen Yehei shemei rabah mevorach la'olam u'lomei olmaya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpo'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal Shmei Dekudsha Brichu Leila Min Kol Birchata V'Shirata Tushbechata V'Nechemata Damiran Ba'alma V'Imru Amen Yehei Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya Achayim Aleinu V'Al Kol Yisrael V'Imru Amen Oseh Shalom Imramav Uyaseh Shalom Aleinu V'Al Kol Yisrael V'Imru Amen. Would the Joel please be seated? Thank Cantor Krasner for leading us in the Mincha service tonight. I want to welcome you to our Tikkun Leil Shavuot. Tikkun Leil Shavuot is the mystical tradition of staying up late on the first night of Shavuot, studying Torah. Why staying up to study Torah? Because Shavuot is the holiday that's associated with the giving of the Torah. The liturgy says this is Man Matan Toratenu, the time of the giving of the Torah. Each of the holidays has an agricultural dimension and a historical dimension. For Shavuot, the agricultural is celebrating the harvest, the first harvest, and in preparation, the bringing of an omer, a measure of barley, each day in preparation for the holiday as a demonstration of the bounty of the land. And of course, the historical aspect of the holiday is how many the Jewish people receive the Torah, which of course will be the subject of the Torah reading for tomorrow morning, the first day of the holiday. For many years, we started our Tikkun after Mariv. That's I guess you might say, the traditional time for starting the Tikkun. But I don't remember how many years ago. I guess it was probably around 2017 or 2018. Cantor Weiss and I and Razy Weiss had this idea that we'd start a little bit earlier to engage those who liked the idea of studying, but didn't always love the idea of doing it at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock at night. We understand that. And I'm glad that you've supported this idea of starting the Tikkun a little bit earlier for the last many years. We're going to begin with the first of our study sessions this evening in just a moment. But before we do, each year on Shavuot, at the Tikkun, I always recall the loving memory of the late Debbie Kaplan of blessed memory, one of our very dear members who we lost on 9/11, some almost 23 years ago. I mention her this evening because in the 5 years that late Debbie, may she rest in peace, and Harold lived here in Paramus until her untimely passing, she was very big part of our annual Tikkun Leil Shavuot. Was participating from the very beginning to the very end. In those days, we used to go to 2 or 3 in the morning. So each year on Shavuot, and especially their Tikkun, remember her memory, her legacy for our congregation. At this time, I'm going to pass out the source sheets for the first session this evening, which I'll be leading. It's called, "And Jacob Was Left Alone," based on a verse in the Torah, the 32nd chapter of the book of Breshit, book of Genesis, verse 25. And thank you, Rabbi Kogan. Rabbi Kogan will I'll pass them out. We have enough for everybody to get their own here. Now, folks, normally I would like to wander into the crowd, but I'm going to be standing up here for a while, so those who are joining us via the miracle of live stream can not only hear, but also see as well. And we welcome those who are joining us on live stream. One of the things I always enjoyed doing from my earliest days of rabbinical school was when we would take a verse from the Torah that we thought we knew a lot about and try to understand not just the verse in its context, but what various, as we say them in Hebrew, mefarshim, commentators, said about the verse. How did they understand it? What in their comments on a particular verse were they adding to our understanding? And one of the really important questions that we were taught in seminary, one that, if you remember nothing else about this evening, I want you always to remember that when we are studying a verse and then reading the commentaries on it, the question is, what is the issue? Or what is the problem that their comment is trying to address? Do you understand? There are certain verses in the Bible that seem pretty simple, and they are. And they don't get much rabbinic commentary. Those of you who are on this in the service last Friday night, I spoke about this a little bit when talking about the flags that each of the tribes of Israel was to rally around when they were marching to the land of Israel. I made the point that night that the fact that there's virtually no commentary on this idea of the flags of the tribes is probably a sign to us that everybody understood what they meant and there wasn't that much to add to it. So there are simple verses that don't need much commentary. But there are also verses that we think are simple, that we think we fully understand their meaning, but nonetheless the Mefarshim, the commentators, saw some issue with, or had a concern about, or nonetheless had a question about that verse. And their answers help us understand what it is that they thought was missing, or what might need to be added to help us fully understand it. There are two terms that I'm going to use this evening, here and there, but also very much a part of the experience of understanding the verse and what our rabbis say about them. The first is known as pshat. Everybody familiar with that word before? Pshat. Pshat translates as the simple, plain, contextual meaning of the verse. You understand? And the second is drash, as in midrash. The non-textual, literal understanding of the verse, which allows the rabbis to demonstrate their creativity, their genius, and to teach lessons based on those verses for us to understand. Now tonight, the verse that I've chosen for tonight, for those who've been to the Tikkun, Leil, Shavuot, you must know that every couple of years I like to do something like this, because I got to be honest with you, I find it very interesting. And I find it's a very good way to expose people who often haven't had the opportunity to study the verse and see just the range of rabbinic commentary on it. I say this with great respect to all those who are listening to me this evening. But for many of us, most of the commentaries on the verses we are familiar with are the ones that are in what I affectionately call the large red Bible in the rack before you, the very wonderful Eitz Chaim Chumash, or Bible, which, by the way, has very wonderful commentary, or the one we had for about 1,000 years before that, the venerable Hertz Chumash. Everybody remember that? It was supposed to last one generation, and it served 3 generations of English-speaking Jewry. And though when we read it today, it seems a little bit dated, but in its time, it was anything but. So for many of us, most of our exposure to rabbinic commentary has been the distilled rabbinic commentary that made its way into one of those volumes. Is that a fair statement? I think it is. But tonight we're going to go to many of the sources that those who brought us those 2 outstanding works used to help provide the context for the verse and the larger meaning of the verses in the Bibles that we've been using in American synagogues, really for the last almost 100 years or so. And tonight I chose a story that many of you, I think, would be familiar with. It's the story of our forefather Jacob. Remember him? Gets in some trouble at home, runs to his uncle Laban. We're with us so far? Sees his cousin Rachel, likes what he sees, makes a deal with her father, his uncle, to work for 7 years for her hand, ends up marrying the sister, and having to agree to work another 7 years for Rachel. Agrees to stay on another 6 years or some additional time. Grows wealthy, but at the same time, his wealth and his skill arouse the jealousy and anger of his wife's brothers. He sees the circumstances for him have changed, and he tells his wives it's time for him to go home. But he doesn't organize his affairs, make a going away party. He literally leaves in the middle of the night. Hint to us that he knows his life and their lives might be in danger. He flees, and at the same time he flees, he knows 2 things: that his uncle sooner or later is going to come looking for him, and when he goes home, he's going to have to confront his brother. His father-in-law finds him. He survives that. And this verse takes place right before the fateful encounter with his brother Esau. he knows, or he thinks, that the threat of violence is real. Why should he be so concerned that his brother wanted to do him harm? Because he took his birthright, and he took the birthright earlier, but he took, in addition to the birthright, the special blessing, which is actually different than the birthright, that traditionally the father extended to the chronologically speaking firstborn son. And also, he said, before Jacob left, I'm going to kill him. So Jacob had reason to fear. And that's where the verse picks up this evening. The first source is the verse itself. That same night he arose, and taking his 2 wives and his 2 maidservants and his 11 sons, he crossed the ford of the Avok, which is a river, and then taking them across the stream, he sent across all of his possessions. Okay? First he sends his family across, right? Then he sends his possessions. Everybody see that? And then, in verse 25, Vayivater Yaakov levado, and Jacob was left alone, or some translations, and Jacob was all alone. And Vayavek ish imo, and they translate this as a figure, or it can easily be translated as a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. Okay? Seems simple enough, right? Danger, splitting his family, taking him across the river, sending his possessions across, and he's the last one. And he's the last one to go. He's all alone. Before we look at the commentaries, what's not clear about that verse? The answer I want you to give is, oh, Rabbi, no, we're good. It seems pretty clear the way it is. Who's the man? What? Who's the man? Who's the man? Well, I have the microphone, so I guess I'm the man. Okay, no. So the question is that what is the nature of this dude that Jacob is in some type of a wrestling match with? So that's the first thing that the rabbis might be concerned about. Who is this Ish, this figure, as it's translated in the most recent Jewish Publication Society translation, or this man, or this entity that Jacob wrestles with? And if he's all alone, where did this guy come from? And then, as we'll see, the other thing that concerns him is, what is the nature of their wrestling? Like, what does that exactly mean? I mean, when we think of wrestling, we think of, the high school wrestling matches. We think of, the WWF, that nonsense. I'm sorry, that form of entertainment. Okay, that's what it means. Something like that to us, right? Or maybe it's a little wilder than that. Maybe they're boxing. Maybe it's more like what's what we're looking for. Full mixed martial arts or something like that. Yes, Rabbi Kogan.
We haven't seen this word, that the phenomenon of such a struggle has not occurred up to this point.
Very good point. Rabbi Kogan is saying is that what is adding to the confusion is that this particular word to describe this type of struggle has not yet been seen in the Bible. We've seen lots of words, but this is the first time we've encountered this, and what might it mean here? So these are some of the things that make this seemingly clear verse perhaps not so clear, and gives the rabbis an opportunity to say something to us based on the verse itself and the fact that there may be larger meanings to this context, or other parts of the Bible or other parts of Jewish literature that might elucidate them and help us understand them better. Everybody with me so far? Terrific. So the first commentary, well, I should start by saying that for almost 1,000 years, the Torah has almost always been studied alongside the commentary of Rashi. That is to say that generally, traditional Jewish education points us in the direction of understanding the Torah in the way that Rashi does. And by the way, that's not a bad thing. Rashi is considered among the greatest, if not the greatest, of the Mefarshim, the commentators on the Torah. So it's always a good place to begin. Again, so the question we ask ourselves when we're reading the commentaries is, what's bothering the rabbis? What's the issue or the problem that they see that with their commentary they want to help us understand or solve it? Now, for those who know a little bit of Hebrew, I've presented the Hebrew and the English sources, but this evening we're going to concentrate on the English sources. V'yavek ish, and a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. Menachem ben Saruk, who was a commentator on the Torah that Rashi is familiar with, not a household word, but nonetheless one that is obviously influences Rashi's thinking, or had something to say that Rashi thinks is worth adding here. Rashi says, this man, Menachem ben Saruk, explains, a man covered himself with dust, taking the verb as connected in the sense with avak, which in Hebrew means dust. It would mean that they were raising dust with their feet through their movements. Okay? Almost like they are saying they were some kind of struggle that lifted the dust up around them. Then he says, I, however, of the opinion that it means he fastened himself on, and that it is an Aramaic word. He's saying we understand this in the Hebrew sense of the word, like this man Menachem ben Saruk does. We should understand it as it's used in Aramaic. Anybody know what Aramaic is? Aramaic is the language that the Jewish people spoke right before, during, and right after the period of the Second Temple. It's the language that the Talmud, that the Talmud is written in. And it was the language of the Jewish people for several hundred years before and after the destruction of the temple. I know this is going to sound a little bit weird tonight on the Tikkun, but I remember about 20 years ago there was that very controversial movie, the Passion of Christ. Remember that? Remember the good old days that was a thing that worried our community? Yeah, that's supposed to make you laugh, right? Remember the meetings we had about that movie? Okay. I went to see that movie with our then rabbinic intern, Moshe Schwartz. I remember seeing it and being astounded by the reaction of the Christians who were there, because everybody there was Christian except me and Moshe Schwartz. It was a very emotional experience I mean, the things that made it difficult and even threatening to Jews were the things that made it so emotional and so significant to many Christians. But the question I heard in the audience was, why is he speaking Aramaic? Shouldn't he have been speaking Hebrew? Remember, the whole movie was in Aramaic. And very, very, very few people in the world today speak Aramaic as a first language. Very few. Most of them are the Chaldean Christians who used to live in Iraq and in Syria, and very few are left. The only people left in the world who spoke Aramaic as a first language. Okay. So their thinking was, Jesus lived in Israel back in the days when that was not a controversial statement. That's supposed to make you laugh. So they figured lived in Israel, how to speak Hebrew. And I remember telling one of them that no, Jesus and all of his friends knew Hebrew because they prayed in Hebrew and they learned the Mishnah in Hebrew, but they probably never spoke in the street a full sentence of Hebrew. Their daily language is Aramaic, which is similar, but not the same as Hebrew. It's not the greatest comparison, but just because you know English, you'll get a few Spanish words, but unless you know Spanish, you're not going to be able to decipher Channel 47 all that well. Think of Aramaic to Hebrew as like that a little bit. But some of the words overlap. But there are words in the English language that you think you know the meaning to that have a very different meaning when they're used in Spanish, even though they're spelled the same and pronounced the same. They mean something different in a different language. And that's what Rashi's saying here. He's saying, no, we should not understand it the way that Menachem ben Sirach does, who is giving you his understanding of what the Hebrew means here. He's saying, no, I think the best way to understand the experience of their wrestling together is to understand this verb, the verb that means wrestling, v'ya'avek, in the way that it's used in Aramaic. Literally, and they've cleaved, or they joined together. It denotes intertwining, for such it is the manner of two people who make strong efforts to throw each other. One clasps the other and twines himself round about him with his arms. He's saying they're not boxing each other. They're not sword fighting. It's like Greco-Roman wrestling. Or if you've ever seen it, it's like a Jewish version of sumo wrestling. Meaning, they're not out trying to beat the stuffing out of each other, but they're kind of this grabbing each other, almost like trying to throw each other off the mat. Does that make sense? Sorry?
It doesn't make sense that they would say that it's an Aramaic word when Aramaic wasn't used in biblical times. Moreover, if they think that it was, then what they're saying is they're admitting that the Torah was put together long after biblical times.
Okay, first, I'm not sure I've already heard what Dinah's saying. Dinah's saying that it's strange that Rashi would bring this in because Aramaic becomes a language that's used much later. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. So why would anybody think that this would be the way to understand it? I think it goes back to something that Rabbi Kogan said earlier. This word, up to this point, is unfamiliar. So we're trying to figure out what it means in the context of two people struggling with each other. One makes it seem that they're kind of like almost like moving around each other, like kind of like, in a boxing match before they start hitting each other, kind of moving around, trying to get the position on each other, raising dust with their feet. Menachem ben Sur ties it to the avak, the idea of dust, meaning that they're moving around kind of like facing off with each other, but they're not throwing hands. This is Rashi's problem with the verse, with the struggle. What is the very nature of their interaction? It's a good question if you ask me. Remember, we're the benefit of thousands of years of reading and commentary and explanation. But Rashi's saying, let's take it down to the basics. When they were in this struggle together, what did that struggle look like? Did it look like they were just kind of sizing each up, moving around the ring with each other? And Rashi's saying, no, I don't think that's the way to understand it. He's saying, I think that the best way to understand it is to understand how it's used in another place that Jews are familiar with, theoretically, the word, how it's used in Aramaic. And again, there are connections between Aramaic and Hebrew. And there, it means some type of like grappling, I guess we would say. Okay? Like I call it Greco-Roman or sumo wrestling, where they're not trying to like punch and hurt each other so much as gain advantage in position over the other. And Rashi's saying that's the way to understand the nature of the interaction between Jacob and this being on that fateful night. Okay? So that's Rashi's issue. Everybody understand any questions on that? Everybody good? Okay. The next source on page 2 is from the great biblical scholar Ibn Ezra from the 14th to 15th century in Spain, also an iconic scholar. He also is dealing with this part of the verse. Vayavek, and they wrestled, and there he wrestled with the man. And Ibn Ezra says, Vayavek comes from the same root as avak, dust. And they struggled so that dust arose between them. He's basically demonstrating that he's familiar with what Rashi had to say on the verse. And he's gently saying, I think he's gently saying, I understand what Rashi says, right? But the first guy that Rashi quoted, Menachem ben Surak, had the right idea, meaning that I don't think we should understand it in the Aramaic sense. We should understand it in the Hebrew sense that Menachem ben Surak had explained. Basically saying, Rashi gives you two options and Rashi likes option number 2 better. But Ibn Ezra is saying, no, I think option number 1, that's the right way to understand the verse. Okay? So you should feel better. You should feel better. Okay. Now, Ramban, the great scholar from Spain from the 13th century. I should start by saying that Ramban is among our most brilliant commentators, and I think it's fair to say among the most difficult to read and understand. You guys think I'm wordy. Oh, come on. You can laugh. That was funny. But Ramban really takes his time to develop his comments and brings in all kinds of sources that demonstrate his tremendous erudition and original thinking. Now, right now, he's not concerned about the wrestling part. He thinks it's self-evident. But no, he wants to deal with another issue, which means, what does it mean that Jacob was all alone? See, there are 2 parts of the verse. Jacob was all alone, and he wrestled with a man until the break of dawn, right? The first 2 comments we've read have dealt with the wrestling thing. Ramban, Nachmanides, is interested in what does it mean to be alone? Why was Jacob alone? That is, for it's forgotten some small jars, and he returned for them. These are the words of Rashi. It's another comment that I did not include of Rashi. But in line with the plain meaning of the scripture, the verse, And he took them and made them pass the brook. It means that he made them, that is to say his whole family, pass together with him. And he made pass that which was his camp and belongings, by commanding others to do it. He returned to the camp after ferrying his family across, and commanded all others pass over the brook before him, so he remained behind them. A little complicated, right? Ramban is addressing the idea of what does it mean that Jacob was all alone? And what was the actual way he went about getting all of his family across? And then seems to have gone back for some small things. Now, in another part of the Jewish tradition, there is a section of the Talmud referring to small items or small jars that Jacob left behind on the other side. He took all the big stuff, but he went back here for a few things he might have by accident left behind. Okay? So now Sforno, a very interesting, one of my favorite commentators, from an Italian rabbi who lived in the 16th century, by Vater Yaakov Levado, and Jacob was all alone. I mean, he was the last to leave the camp, as he was busy directing all of his family and servants to cross the fording, so that nothing would be left behind. What's the issue there? What is the item that Sforno wants us to make sure we understand when we read this verse? Does everybody see what the issue is? What does it mean he was all alone? The idea is that he was all alone after he made sure that the rest of the family had crossed safely over. Why was it so important that the whole family cross over? Because his sense was that Esau wasn't just going to come and do harm to Jacob and saying, but you know, your family is off limits. That the harm that Esau might seek to do to Jacob would be extended to all those that Jacob loved and cared about. Okay. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit. He sent them first across the stream. No. He sent them across the stream first, so that they would be ahead of him, and Esau would encounter him first, because the family had already crossed over. No, he was sending them. No, I think it's very much the opposite. No, I think it's. No, I think it's very much the opposite. I think it's very much the opposite. Okay. Now, on page 4, I want you to read the last commentary, which says Rabbeinu Bachya, also a very wonderful commentary on the Torah with kind of new and, for the time, original and well thought out ideas. And it's going to explain this idea of what he was going back to look for. Vayivater Yaakov Levado, when Jacob was all alone. Our sages in Breshit Rabbah, the compendium of midrashim, of rabbinic legends on Breshit, states that these words should be read as if Jacob returned for his jug. You should read it as Chado instead of Levado. It's a play on words here. That Jacob went back for his jars or for his jug, and this teaches that Jacob went back across the river to retrieve small vessels which had been overlooked. Again, Bible made a big deal of saying that he already sent all this stuff over the world, over the stream, right? Which, by the way, we have to must remember, he had 2 wives, 2, we'll call them half-wives, okay? 2 other women who bore his children, the maidservants of his wives, who he eventually was in a quasi-marriage relationship with. He had 11 sons. He had a daughter. What else did he have? He had a crazy amount of sheep. How do we know that? Because in one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult chapter of the entire Torah, and certainly in the book of Genesis, the book of Breshit, where there's that story about how he got his sheep to reproduce at a much faster rate than Jacob's. Than Laban's. Which is why his brother-in-laws are so mad at him. Because they had the better animals. And Jacob said, I'll take all the junky ones. Right? And made them reproduce like rabbits. Using techniques that the Bible assumes were very well known to ancient shepherds. Without vouching for the efficacy of them, they seem to be, the popular belief is that this is how you get sheep to mate more frequently. Yes?
And the fact that he was able to bring all the sheep along with him is verified in the following chapter when he gives so many of the sheep to his brother Esau as a peace offering.
Absolutely, but the point is that, okay, that's an excellent point. Right, remember in the beginning, for those who know the story, in the beginning of the next parsha, Jacob sends really big gifts of livestock to his brother, one after another. I mean this in the nicest way possible. How many of you have ever worked on a farm? I don't mean like you've watched a few episodes of Yellowstone or anything like that. So have you ever worked on a farm? Really? You have? Right. Okay. Moving animals across a body of water is very difficult. Okay? It's not like, those cute videos of like dogs swimming in your neighbor's pool or anything like that. It's very difficult to get a large number of animals from here to here if they have to cross water. It's slow, it's painstaking, and difficult. So you have to understand, he's got family, he's got property, he's got livestock. It's not like, you're skipping across a few puddles and that's how you ford the Jabbok River. It's a big deal. And that's the context in which we understand things. And then after doing all that, he went back for a couple of jars, he went back for something. There's a larger message in that. There's a larger lesson in that. This teaches that Jacob went across the river to retrieve small vessels which had been overlooked. This teaches that the righteous are very meticulous with even relatively low-cost items, seeing that when you acquire things, by making certain that none of them has been tainted by being stolen or otherwise illegally acquired, one does treasure what one has more than do people who do not acquire things less honestly. What's the lesson here? It's an allusion to this idea that by this tradition in the Gemara, that Jacob seemed to have gone back over to the other side to collect the few things he left behind, making a statement about the value of things that we've worked to achieve all on our own. There's a sense that the people that Jacob was spending time with, many of their gains were not so legitimately acquired. But Jacob's property was all legitimately acquired. And therefore, it was particularly dear to him. And from there, they're teaching a larger lesson about the value of things that we achieve honestly and legally, which have a value all of their own. And he says, this is Rashi's approach to the verse. Another verse, the vessels were used to drink out of. And Jacob was concerned that the younger children should have a chance to drink from them on the journey. According to this interpretation, the correct translation of the words would be pachim ketanim. Not that he went back to retrieve small items, but rather vessels that the small ones, meaning the children, could drink from. It's a play on the Hebrew here. Okay? Which is a traditional technique for deducing the meaning of words in the Torah. He endangered himself in order to have convenient drinking vessels for his small children. Okay? So here, let's go back to what I began with, the idea of pshat and drash, right? What's pshat? Anybody remember? The plain meaning of the text. But drash is midrash. It's the more homiletical, the non-contextual understanding of the Torah. The plain understanding of the text is that he gets his family over to a relatively safer place while he remains behind. That's the plain, simple verse, right? The homiletical verse here, understanding here, is what? He stays behind to get the glasses that he left behind, which you might have thought, okay, I've already crossed over, no big deal, just leave them here. And one verse says no, because they're yours, and you obtain them honestly and morally and legally. Their value is immaterial. They're significant because you acquired them on your own. And then the other midrashic or homiletical understanding is that no, even though he had gone over, he was so concerned about the welfare of his children that he went back and made sure that they had little glasses to drink from, the kind that children would be accustomed to, so the journey would be that much easier for them. Any questions up to this point? Okay. On that same page, page 5, the middle one, again, Rabbeinu Bachya, V'ya'avek ish imo. Once again, a man wrestled with him. He wants to go back to this particular section of the verse. Now that he's dealt with the idea of what does it mean to be left all alone and why, he wants to get back to the interaction between Jacob and this entity with whom he struggles. According to the plain meaning of the text, which in Hebrew, al derech hapshat, remember that word again, according to the plain, simple way that we should understand the verse, the meaning of vayavek is the same as vaychabek, seeing that the letters aleph and hey and ayin and het are frequently interchangeable. Okay? He's saying the letters sometimes get mixed around in Hebrew. And our sages in Sota, that's a section of the Talmud, use the word avukah and chavukah interchangeably. Okay? And he says an avuka is a torch. It's so called that it's composed of pieces of wood that embrace each other. Literally, they are chavuk, they are joined together. What is the problem in the verse that Rabbi Bachai is trying to solve? And once again, what does it mean that that Jacob and the Ish wrestled together? Again, that's an English translation. What was the nature of their interaction? And here, like one of the earlier commentators, Rashi, said literally they were like grappling with each other or wrestling with each other as we would think of it, not punching each other like boxing, not sizing each other up, but really like wrestling each other, grabbing each other. That was the nature of their interaction. Okay, we have time for one or two more. Okay. I want us to turn now to the middle of page 6. Vayivater Yaakov levado. Once again, the Rashbam, who is in the generation of Rashi's of the generation of Rashi's grandchildren, who often a tremendous biblical scholar, who often took issue with Rashi's comments and understandings of the Torah. He says, what does it mean that Jacob was all alone? After he had transferred all of his belongings to the other side of the river, so that the only one still to be brought across was himself. The reason that he wanted to cross only after everyone else had crossed was that he intended to flee in a different direction so as to avoid a face-to-face encounter with Esau. Okay. Is that what you're referring to? So he's not leaving his family in a more vulnerable position, but now having them cross over, he could move in a completely different direction. Now, it's probably good to point out here that in the verses that precede this, Jacob takes his family and splits them into separate camps. Why is that? Basic military theory. You don't have your entire army in one spot. Why? Because if the enemy takes them all on there and is victorious, you lose everything. Okay? Without getting all weird on this, in the United States, some of our tremendous, most significant military failures have been when we've had too many assets in one place and they've been overrun. This is just a simple thing that teach you, and teach a little on your first day in OCS. All right. So Jacob says, Esau's coming with violent purposes. I'm going to split them into two camps, so if he attacks one, the other ones can get away. But this comment adds, okay, they're going to get away, and they're going to get away, but I'm going to get away as well. Or that may have been the one that you were referring to, a variant of that you were referring to earlier. Yes? Okay.
I always took this whole situation that we're doing tonight, and I really turned this over to Richard because he's the psychiatrist here. I always felt that Jacob was never wrestling with any individual. I thought Jacob was wrestling with his mind.
Well, okay.
And I always felt that I don't care about dust. He was shaking up his mind, and the good and the bad in Jacob. That's what the wrestling was all about to me.
Okay.
Because as we learned, I believe you taught me and other people taught me, that God or an angel
Okay.
He fought. It's the good and the bad within Jacob that is wrestling.
Okay.
Whoever comes out on top, I don't know yet. But I'm just saying, to me, it's a psychological fight, Doc.
What's the bad?
He's done bad all his life.
What's the good?
He's trying to be good.
Okay. So
His future's going to be good. I always felt, I really do. To me, when Jacob was down in Egypt to see his son, Joseph, I see a real patriarch. And before that, I never saw anything that great in Jacob.
okay. Okay. So let me say a couple of quick things. First, Jacob is understood to be righteous by the traditional commentaries, who knew full well of his foibles and his errors. But they also know that somehow, and that the Bible goes out of its way on many occasions to remind us that despite it all, God was with Jacob. Okay? So that's number one. Number two, there have been many, especially more modern commentators, who have thought to see this idea of Jacob's encounter with the angel, or with the man, or with the something, with the entity, as something going on internal with Jacob. Okay? Along the lines of what you're saying. The problem with that is at the end of his encounter with the angel, what happens?
He calls him Israel.
The angel changes his name to Israel, and he bashes him on the hip so that he limps for the rest of his life. Okay? So it's hard to make the case that we should interpret this metaphorically when two very significant things happen as a result. One, the changing of a name. Who else has their name changed in the book of Breshit, the book of Genesis? Abraham and Sarah. Who changes their name? God changes their name. So the fact that this angel had the power to tell Jacob, you will no longer be called Jacob, but you're now Yisrael, which is also related to the idea of Yasar El, the one who contends with or wrestles with God, leads me to believe that, again, the traditional Mefarshim, the traditional commentators, want us to view this as a real event with a real outcome. Right? Okay, real getting in the ring and throwing things around. Right? But it does change Jacob. Now, I want to jump down to one particular commentary, because I think, if nothing else, it'll answer the question that Dinah raised about a half an hour ago. I think, and we will close with that this evening, okay? So on the bottom of page, I guess that would be page 7. Again, regarding the entity that Jacob encountered, our sages have explained that this was Esau's guardian angel. Okay? Again, we don't have the time tonight for a whole discussion of angels in the Midrash, angels in the book of Genesis. We just don't have a time for that tonight. So let's not think about that too hard. Let's just accept that as it is. That the angel, the entity that Jacob was wrestling with, was Esau's guardian angel. He came out to do some reconnaissance before Esau actually showed up, all right? Rashi proves this on by saying, if I have found favor in your eyes, like seeing the face of a godly being. And he says, you might ask, what caused Rashi to make the forced explanation that Vayavek is of Aramaic origin, instead of saying like Menachem did, which is exactly what Dinah said some 1,000 years later. Okay? Saying, why does Rashi need to go all the way up to the forward into the Talmudic area when people are more familiar with Aramaic? The answer is, it is because our sages say that this was Esau's guardian angel. And in Chula 91, that according to that view, they kicked up some dust. They raised dust into the throne of glory. But Esav's guardian angel could not reach such a lofty level. So what we have here is that this particular commentary says there was no reason for Rashi to go off in that direction, because we have a perfectly good, and I think he's gently saying, and I'm looking with one eye on Rabbi Kogan to see if he's going to start shaking his head up or down or left and right. He's saying we have an older and better tradition that solves the problem. And he says that the dust that they raised reached the throne of heaven, throne of glory, meaning that almost as if Jacob's, in there mixing it up, Jacob's dust rose higher than Esau, meaning that this was the proof of his victory over him. Okay? I think on that we will close this evening. I hope that this opportunity to study various commentators, by the way, by no means all of them. I stuck to one this evening that by people that you may have heard of in the past, and also ones that were readily available in Hebrew and in English. And I hope this adds not only a little of understanding about this very important verse in the Torah, but also how our rabbis went around imagining the biblical verses, and how and why it is they came up with the type of commentary that we find in our Chumashim, and help us better understand what the verses in the Torah are all about. Friends, at this point, I'm going to invite you all to please rise as we're going to call Cantor Krasner to lead us in the Mariv service this evening of Shavuot. Before we do that, I just want to give you a sense of what the rest of the evening is going to be like. I'm sure many of you saw the many emails we put out. But we're going to conduct the Mariv service. After that, we're going to invite everybody out into the upper lobby for some Shavuot refreshments. And then Rabbi Kogan is going to teach a session from 9:45 to 10:15. And then my son Sam was going to teach a session following that and then I will do the last session. Each of the next 3 sessions will be 30 minutes each in duration. Would you all please rise now, as on page 15, on page 28, Cantor Krasner will lead us in the Mariv service.
Baruch Hu et Adonai Amvarach.
Baruch Adonai Amvarach, Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Amvarach, Le'olam Va'ed.
Friends, we are seated.
Ma'aviyam, Umei Vilayla, Ma'avdiya Beyavela, Adonai Tzoshema, Elecha Elekayam, Tamidim Lachaleinu Le'olam Baruch, Ata Adonai, Amari Baravi.
Amen.
Ki chayenu v'yorech yameinu v'amnega yamam alayla v'yamatcha atasir mimenu l'olamim aruch ata Adonai ohev amo Yisrael.
Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad.
Adonai lechem emet. Amavir bana ben Yisrael mesu erorfehem etrayem itamati ba v'rov hagevorata shimcho v'tolishma u'machota v'rata rechibalei Moshe v'nei Yisrael lechanu shira v'simcha rabba v'yamru chulam v'yamru chulam Atila Rosefene Machutecha Rovanecha Vakayam Lifnei Moshe Zeili Anov Yamro V'nehem Hakif Adonai et Yaakov Ugealam Yachasach Imenu Baruch Ata Adonai Kal Yisrael. Ki Yashamreinu Matzileinu Ata Ki Melechanu V'rachum Ata Ushmor Tzeitzin Amoeinu L'chaim Ushalam Yatavi Adolam Ufrosalim Sukkot Shlomecha Baruch Ata Adonai Haporei Sukkot Shalom Aleinu V'yaklam Yisrael V'yahirushalayim.
Page 34, would you all please rise? Vaydaber Moshe Moadei Adonai el bnei Yisrael.
Vaydaber Moshe Moadei Adonai el bnei Yisrael.
Friends, the Chatzi Kaddish on the bottom of 34 is followed by the Amidah for this evening of Shavuot, being on page 41. These are in special sections for this evening of Shavuot.
Yikata v'yikatash shemei rabba v'yalamad yivrach yirute v'yamlich malchute b'chayeichon u'v'yameichon u'v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael b'kala u'v'yizmalek ha'ariveh v'yimeru. Amen. Yesh me Rabba me barach Liolamo me amaya Yipara v'yishtabach V'yipar v'yitzma v'naseh V'yatav v'yitalev v'yitalash V'yikodesh ha'bericho Le'yehela Min kabirchata v'shirata Tushbechata v'nehechemata Damir al'meyama v'yimeru. Amen. יקרא ויקרש מרבה, מעמד ירחי ותבלך מלכות בחייכון וחייכו בישראל, בקלה בזמן קריב, ויאמרו אמן, ישמר רבה מבורך, ילדם המאמי,
Baruch.
יפרח וישבח ויפרח ויתרע מנשא, ויתרע ותלב ויתלש מן הקודש
ברכו.
לילה מכל ברכת ויש ברכת הנחמתת אמירה מימה ויאמרו
Amen.
תקבל אצלו טוב ואות לכל ישראל כל מבהונים וישמע ויאמרו
Amen.
יש להם רב משמעיה וחיים עלינו וכל ישראל ויאמרו
Amen.
עשה שלום ירמיו
Hu yaseh shalom. Shalom b'mramav. Hu yaseh shalom.
עלינו וכל ישראל
Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael.
אמרו אמן
Amen. Page 50, the Kiddush in honor of this evening of Shavuot.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, borei pri hagafel.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'am, roman mikol ha'shon, v'kiddushav mitzvotav, v'tyalanu Eloheinu b'yava, מועלים לשמחה, חגים וזמנים לששון. את יום חג השבועות הזה, זמן מתן תורתנו מקרא קודש, זכר ליציאת מצרים. כי באנו בחרת ואותנו קידשת מכל העמים, ומועדי קודשך בשמחה ובששון נחלתנו. ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש ישראל והזמנים.
Amen.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהחיינו וקיימנו וקיימנו לזמן הזה.
Amen. As we continue on page 51 with the sing of Aleinu. Shabeach ladon hakol, latet gedula liotzer v'reishi, shelo asanu goyeh haratzot, velo samanu v'shkot adama, shelo sam helkenu kahem, v'gor aleinu kechol hamonam,
ואנחנו קוראים משחבים ומודים לבני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך
Baruch
הוא.
Hu. Shemot Shemayim v'yosed haaretz. Lo sheviko Shemayim ha'alu shkinat hazav v'gav him mimim Eloheinu eino. Al ken ekafel echad Adonai.
כתבתך עניים לך לעולם אבהד
V'ne'emar v'hayim Adonai melech al kol haaretz. Bayom hahu, bayom hahu, yeh Adonai echad. U'shemo
ושמו אחד.
Friends, we now turn to page 250, the words of the 121st Psalm. We hope and pray for the speedy release of all of Israel's captives. Shir Lamalot, Esa Enai, El Ha'arim, Me'ayin Yavo, Ezri Me'im Adonai, Osei Shemayim Va'aretz, Al Yatenu Ut Raglecha, Al Yanum Shomrecha, Inei Lo Yanum V'lo Yishan Shomer Yisrael, Adonai Shomrecha, Adonai Tzilcha, Al Yad Yaminecha, Yamam HaShemesh Lo Yakecha V'rech B'layla, Adonai Nafshecha, Adonai Yishmor Tzecha V'echa, Me'ata V'ad Olam. Mourner's Kaddish. Yit Gadal, V'yit Kadash, Shemei Rabbah,
Amen.
V'yolma Divarach Yerutei, V'yamlich Malchutei, V'chayechon U'v'yomechon, U'v'chayei Dechol Beit Yisrael, V'agala U'v'izman Kariv, V'yimeru, Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevorach, L'olam U'lo Me'om Haya, Yit Barach, V'yishtabach, V'yit Po'ar, V'yit Ramam, V'yit Nasei, V'yit Hadar, V'yit Aleh, V'yit Halal, Shmei Dekudsha Brechu, La'ela Min Kol Birchata V'Shirata, Tushbechata V'Nechemata, Da'amiran Ba'alma V'Yimeru Amen. Yehei Shlama Rabba Min Shmaya, V'Chaim Aleinu V'Al Kol Yisrael V'Yimeru Amen. Oseh Shalom B'Mrav, Uyaseh Shalom, Aleinu V'Al Kol Yisrael V'Yimeru Amen. Chag Sameach, everyone. Chag Sameach. Friends, we'd like to invite everyone into the upper lobby as we have some Shavuot food to enjoy. And then about 10 minutes or so, we'll come back in here as Rabbi Kogan will begin our next session for the Tikkun, entitled Attuning Ourselves to the Hallel Service. Again, that will be 30 minutes in duration. So please grab a little food and come on back in.
What is? No.
All right, folks, we're going to begin the next session with Rabbi Cohen teaching us Hallel at this time.
Okay. I do not have a handout because you have a bound handout. Okay. Now, the session I'm going to teach now is an expanded version of something that some of you have heard me teach in the Bodine Chapel in a 5-minute version. And this is a 30-minute version. The idea is that when we do the Hallel, the service is a little bit longer than usual, partly because the Hallel adds time, and when we sing it, it takes longer than when we mumble it. And so there's no time to dig into the Hallel. So my thought is that if we want to take that deep dive into the Hallel, then we need to do it at a time other than the service where the Hallel is being done. So tomorrow morning and the next morning we'll be doing the Hallel, as well as a whole bunch of other times during the year. In fact, we think of the Hallel as this rare and unusual supplement to the service, but this rare and unusual supplement is done so many times during the year that it's actually more than 10% of the days in the year that we do the Hallel. Because after all, we do the Hallel on Shavuot, we do it on Sukkot, we do it on Pesach, we do it on Hanukkah, we do it on Rosh Chodesh, which is sometimes 1 day, sometimes 2 days. There are a few times when you might expect we would do it when we don't do it. And then, of course, there's a little bit of friendly debate about doing it on Yom Yerushalayim, on the day when we commemorate the reunification of the city of Jerusalem, and of course on Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day. But certainly 40-odd times during the year, so it's worth our while, I figure, to gain some understanding. And I'm going to do two things. One is I want to give a bird's eye view of the Hallel, and then I want to drill down on selected passages. In my preparation for this session, I looked through 4 books in particular that are commentaries either on the Book of Psalms, from which the Hallel is taken, or on the Siddur itself. And I'd be happy to share the sources with you, either in the question-answer period, or if there are further refreshments or other informal ways we can converse about it. Or I might actually blurt out 1 or 2 of the sources as we go. When I taught this in the chapel, I found myself saying, whoever wrote the Hallel had a lot of life experience under his belt, and with apologies to Frank Sinatra, I said, it seems like the kind of person who could have said, I've been a pauper, a pirate, a pauper, a poet, a pirate, a pawn, and a king. And, you know, we do see some of those dimensions, though I have to apologize to those who were there before when I ascribed this to Frank Sinatra, because in the past week when I looked it up, it turns out Frank Sinatra did not write those lyrics. He simply heard the song being played on the radio while he was driving his car, and he said, oh, I could sing that. And he phoned Nancy, his daughter, said, find out for me who wrote that, because I want to negotiate a deal that I can sing that. So it's sometimes surprising about authorship. And it's also, there's also kind of a puzzle about who wrote the Psalms. That is, there's a traditional point of view that says King David wrote the Psalms, and that's not surprising because many of the songs start with the phrase, a song of David, or something along those lines. Although other Psalms, it seems that our intuition might lead us the other way, that maybe somebody other than King David, you know, but that's not my central point. So again, we can discuss that perhaps informally. This will go for later. Okay. So the Hallel consists of Psalms 113 to 118 and is preceded by a short bracha, and the other bookend is a paragraph ending with a bracha. It seems that these 6 Psalms were likely a unit going way back, maybe even to biblical times, and that they were recited on festivals in the temple in Jerusalem. And in that sense, we're kind of reenacting and keeping alive the memory of the temple, and perhaps in some ways the hopes for the restoration of the temple, although we might have some interesting debate on whether we'd like to replicate all the activities that were done in the temple, or perhaps a subset of the activities that were done in the temple in ancient times. But of course, that's not a front burner issue because of the mosque, and we don't see that changing anytime soon. So the Hallel is a type of prayer, but not the type that most American society thinks of when you say prayer. Because when most people in this country think about the idea of a prayer, they think of a request. Like, oh Lord, please let me win the lottery, right? Or something of that kind. But there are other dimensions to prayer too. There is prayer of praise that we use, for example, in what you might call the warm-up part of the Amidah, and there is prayer of thanksgiving, kind of celebratory prayer. Sometimes, even in ancient times, that was accompanied by singing, or maybe even by instrumental type of music. And we think that the Hallel was such a group of celebratory prayers. Now, I built into my preparation a little Hallel trivia as well. That is a privilege for those who are physically present in the room. There may be a lot of people who are following on the live stream, but no matter how fervently you raise your hand, I'm sorry I can't call on you. But so first of all, does anybody know how many Psalms there are in the book of Psalms, the Hebrew book of Tehillim? Yes, Lana. 150. Bingo. Okay. Extra piece of cheesecake. And does anybody know what's the longest psalm? Anybody know? I'll give you a hint. It is alphabetical, but it has more than one alphabet in it. Okay. What's that? Nope. 119. Psalm 119 has the Hebrew alphabet times 8. If you need a little mathematical assistance, that's 176 verses. It's longer than the Ashrei. It's longer than a sonnet. It's longer than a lot of things. And the shortest psalm? Well, do I hear 117? Bingo. Okay. Very good, Hope. 117, which is within the Hallel, so we will be speaking about that. Okay. All right. Two other trivia questions I want to save for a little later. Let us go into the Hallel, which you can find in your Siddur on page 133, the beginning of the Hallel. So we start the Hallel with a bracha that is structured a lot like the blessing that we say when we light the Shabbat candles, or several other things. The first of these 6 psalms seems to be universal in its concerns. That is, not just Jewish concerns, but all people ought to praise God. There's a kind of exuberance to this. From the rising of the sun to the setting of the sun, God's name is to be praised. Now, our translation here takes that in a spatial sense from east to west, whereas others interpret it in terms of time, that is, from dawn to dusk. That's certainly another way of understanding from the rising of the sun to the setting of the sun. In other words, if we wanted to really focus on the majesty of God's works, we could do it all day long. Though obviously we have other things to do, so we try to be concise in our words. We're also told that God is exalted above the nations, and that's a hint of our sense that we'll see a little deeper into the Hallel, that our invisible God has broader powers than some of the gods of other peoples, but that's more softly stated here. It'll be stated more emphatically a little bit later. In the commentary of Ibn Ezra, when he says that God is exalted beyond all the nations, or that God's glory extends beyond the heavens, he takes that to mean that the scope of what God can do is beyond the ability of all nations to express. So he's trying to stay within the boundaries of a universal poem in this particular psalm, and so that's how he interprets it. And then who is like Adonai our God enthroned on high? So beyond the confines of space, and yet God keeps an eye on what's going on down in the world below, and does things like raising needy people out of their circumstances and seating them among the powerful, meaning that that there is hope in the world. Hope is a divine gift, and that not every person is stuck in the same rut that he finds himself in at the moment on a permanent basis. Then when we get to the second of these psalms, which is on the bottom part of page 133, there is a focus on God's relationship with the people of Israel. There's the shared experience of our having been taken out of the slavery in Egypt by God has enabled our people to develop a relationship of distinctiveness and to embark on a special relationship with God. Of course, on the way out of Egypt, we saw some remarkable things. On top of the 10 plagues, we saw the parting of the Red Sea, and so there's the rhetorical question to the sea, why did you flee? And the response is, I fled from the master of the universe because he told me to. There is, in poetic parallel, Malacha Hayam Kitanus Hayardain Tisov Lachor, along with the Red Sea. Why did the Jordan split as well? And there are two traditional interpretations of that. One is the Rashi interpretation, who says that at the time of the parting of the Red Sea, all the waters in the world split at the very same time. That would be, a very supernatural interpretation, whereas Ibn Ezra, who is more of a rationalist, says that this is simply a reference to what happened 40 years later when Joshua brought the children of Israel into the Promised Land. They crossed the Jordan, and the Jordan split for them, as is recounted in chapter 3 of the book of Joshua. So that is the first two chapters of the 6. I'm going to return to trivia for a moment. When we recite the Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, it is always a partial Hallel, sometimes referred to as a half Hallel. And that is the case on every new moon except one. Who can identify the new moon when we don't do the Hallel? The month of Tishrei, right. Rosh Hashanah, we don't do the Hallel. Why do you suppose it is, by the way, that we don't do the Hallel on Rosh Hashanah or on Yom Kippur? There's too much else in the service. True. But all of those medieval liturgical poems weren't written yet when the decision was made to not include the Hallel on the high holidays. So there has to be another reason. And I think that is that on the high holidays we are penitent, we are supplicating, we are not triumphant. The triumphant time comes later that month when we get to Sukkot. But on Rosh Hashanah, it's not appropriate for us to, so to speak, to count our chickens before they're hatched. So we are focusing on teshuvah, repentance, on the high holidays. One other holiday that that one might think we would be doing the Hallel, but we don't. And that is Purim. It's a little surprising because we do the Hallel on Hanukkah, which liturgically is similar to Purim. That is, it's not a festival with restrictions. We do add the Al Hanisim on Hanukkah, and we add the Al Hanisim on Purim. But why no Hallel on Purim? There isn't a complete consensus on that, but I would suggest that the main reason is because the Purim story is one that took place to a subset of the Jewish people, and a subset of the Jewish people that is outside the land of Israel is less likely to be regarded as happening to the whole Jewish people. If it were the subset of the Jewish people that's in the land of Israel, and there are, other expatriates in the diaspora, then that's still intuitively happening to the Jewish people. But the Purim story apparently doesn't rise to that level. It's a little surprising, but that is the way it is.
Maybe because the Purim story includes the Jews slaughtering their enemy, including men, women, and children, and maybe that's not something we really should be celebrating in a Hallel.
While I'm sympathetic with that thought, but I'm not sure that I would be surprised if that's the reason that determination was made. Of course, fighting the Romans, didn't involve women and children on the Roman side. Of course, we weren't always successful. Or fighting the Greeks didn't involve women and children on the Greek side. But we do understand, and unfortunately, even the situation today in Israel forces us to understand that war is not clean, and that there will be collateral damage. We don't, in the Purim story, though, now that I think about it, we don't read of a lot of women and children being victimized in the Jewish counter-insurgency, other than the sons of Haman, who we understand to have been co-conspirators. So, I think it might be well to reread the Megillah with that in mind, and I may be disproven, but that's my recollection of the Megillah. Okay. Okay. One more trivia question, and then we'll dive back in. There is one time when we recite the Hallel on a Rosh Chodesh, but we recite the full Hallel rather than the partial Hallel. when and how does that come about? Yes. Yes, indeed. Okay. That's the Schechter dollars at work. Yes, because Hanukkah starts on the 25th of the month and it lasts for 8 days. So there's got to be Rosh Chodesh in there. Exactly. Okay. Now back on page 134, we have Psalm 115, which we tend to view as two different paragraphs, and that's how it's presented here in the Siddur as well. But in the Tanakh, in the Bible, it is one unified psalm. So I want to make the attempt to view it as one unified piece. So we know that God's assistance to the people of Israel brings honor to God's name and in addition makes clear to the world to some extent that competing ideas, that is the notion that idols have power, is kind of undermined by the inadequacy of what idols do. So this chapter is a polemic against idols, and we're told that just like the idols, those who made the idols will be as powerless as the raw materials from which they had fashioned their idols. Now, the opening line of this psalm says that when we turn to God for help, we turn not only for our own sake, but for the sake of God's name. That is, it's a PR question for God, that the world should know that our God is the supreme God. And so after we see a few lines that speak about the powerlessness of the idols, we see an encouragement that the people of Israel should have faith or have trust in God, and similarly the house of Aaron, that is the priests, should have trust in God, and Yirei Adonai, those who fear God, should also have trust in God. It's not clear if Yirei Adonai, those who fear God, is a reference to the rest of the Jewish people, or perhaps to others who lived among the Jews who are being encouraged to see things from our perspective. But near the end of the psalm, we see a fairly straightforward statement that the dead don't have the power to praise God, but we who are alive welcome the opportunity to praise God, and so that's what we do. And the closing word is hallelujah. Hallelujah means give praise, like the Hallel. Hallelujah, give praise to God. That's Psalm 115. We turn the page, and we have another psalm that is presented in two halves on the page, mainly because of how we divide it and we leave out one portion of it to create the partial Hallel. And if we have time, maybe near the end, I'll talk about the partial Hallel, which is a little less essential for us to dig into. On page 135, so Psalm 116 is a psalm that was likely recited in fulfillment of a vow. That is, people would come to the central temple in Jerusalem to sometimes to fulfill a vow. That is, if such and such happens, then I will bring a sacrifice to God. Somewhat reminiscent of in the book of Samuel, when Hannah had difficulty conceiving, and she says, if I have a child, then such and such will happen. So we see here someone looking forward to having the opportunity to fulfill a vow, having seen their wishes come true. Rabbi Reuven Hammer of the conservative movement suggests that this is not so different from when someone is cured from an illness or saved from danger. We call them up to the Torah and they say the blessing of Hagomel. So there may be a relationship between Hagomel and the fulfillment of our wishes. After all, we're not going to bring a sacrifice. That's not within the repertoire that we have an opportunity to do. Various commentators on the Psalms tried to identify some of the situations being depicted in the Psalms. So this particular psalm, according to Rashi, he suggests that this psalm was a prayer of David when he heard that King Saul had died, and that put to an end the repeated attempts by King Saul on not yet King David's life. So that's one possibility of the situation being responded to in this psalm, though others say that the psalm is simply first person singular, and it could refer to an individual or to the people of Israel collectively. Just below the midpoint, in what is the second paragraph on our page, we have the phrase Kos Yeshuot Esa Uv'Shem Adonai Akra. I will raise the cup of deliverance and invoke Adonai by name. You're familiar with this verse from the Havdalah, but this is the source of that verse. And then near the bottom of the page, L'cha ezbach zevach todah, the translation does interesting things with this. I will honor my vows to God. I guess the translator didn't want to put sacrifices into here, so that's how he translated it. But the idea of fulfilling a vow, in this case via sacrifice, circles back to the point of this psalm in bringing a sacrificial gift as the closest that we can come to reciprocating for divine grace. That is, if we feel that God has saved us from a situation that threatened our lives, then finding a way to express our thanks to God is what we want to do. Page 136, the very short psalm, number 117. So all the nations should offer praise to God. One wonders what would motivate the nations to do so. So our translation says, God's love has overwhelmed us. God's faithfulness endures forever. We can say intuitively that all the nations benefit from the world that God has created, and so all the nations ought to turn to God with some recognition and some praise. Psalm 118, which is the final psalm, a little bit longer than the others, but we're going to deal with it a little more concisely. So we have 4 verses that end with the refrain, Ki la'olam chasto, for God's love endures forever, which is a refrain we're familiar with also from the Seder. That is, after the visit of Elijah, we have Psalm 136, in which that refrain repeats a lot more than 4 times. Then we have a person narrating in general terms that God has saved him or her from a narrow place, from a predicament, and help them to find safety and freedom. We then go from that to a series of ways in which we express thanksgiving, and at the very bottom of page 136, Pitchu li sharei tzedek. So now that I have had a chance to state on the way into the temple why I'm here, so now I request formal permission to pass through the gates, to enter the temple, and to give thanks. The balance of this psalm consists of formal thanks, which is conveyed in poetic style with a call and response, and then, of course, we finish with the paragraph at the bottom of page 137, which concludes in a bracha. Now, one final point to ponder. It's kind of a puzzle. Our religious activity is often community-based. This is true for reasons of education, for reasons of ruach, or if you will, esprit de corps, and because of our clear understanding that the power of community sustains the optimism of the individuals. And yet we know in our heart that the gateway to a relationship with God is likely to be private, personal experience through which we will need to pass as individuals. So the tension between faith on an individual basis and faith on a community basis is something that we're continually struggling with. How shall we balance these two approaches is something to ponder that is beyond the scope of what I can tell you in half an hour. I thank you for your participation and for your attention.
As we're going to begin, I want to thank Rabbi Kogan. We're going to begin the next section now and call Sam Weiner forward, who will be giving a discussion of Genesis chapter 11, Babbling on a Stairway to Heaven, the story of the Tower of Babel. I'll be passing out the source material at this time.
So every year, when we come together for the Tikkun Leil Shavuot, everyone who comes to put a session together is thinking about what is the interesting Jewish topic they want to delve into. A story from the Torah, a piece of halacha, Jewish law, something to do with tefillah, how we daven, or maybe something in Jewish philosophy. But it's also sort of challenging, and certainly for me this year, to not think a little bit about the climate that's surrounding Shavuot. And for me, thinking about the climate surrounding Shavuot has a lot to do with our discourse, our public discourse, the way people speak to other people. If you flip on the news, there's plenty of bad. And even though we all, I shouldn't say we all, many of us get our news in English, there's a lot of news in English where people are talking to each other in the same language, but either talking past each other or twisting words to make a point, let alone if you get your news from sources outside the United States, be they foreign, non-US news sources speaking in English, let alone a foreign language. And where does that all come from? It comes from here. It comes from the story of the Tower of Babel, Migdal Babel, the Tower of Babel. But the question that I ask everyone at the outset is, Rabbi Wiener, my dad talked about this earlier this evening. You have the pshat of the story. You have the simple story, the pshat, the pashut, that which is simple and just the story the Torah tells. And then you have the midrash, you have the exegesis, you have the explanation that helps us understand what are the simple words of the Torah actually telling us. So the question I open with is the following. What happened at Bavel, and was it all that bad? Many sitting here probably know the story of the Tower of Babel, but if it's not a story you're familiar with, you just want a refresher, let's take a look specifically at what the Torah tells us occurred at this place. Let's take a step back and just set this story in context. You have the story of Adam, everything that goes on in Parshat Bereshit. The next parsha up is Noach. Everyone knows the story of Noah and the flood. After the story of Noah and the flood, the Torah has to set up what comes next. Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Yafet. They have their own children, so Noah has grandchildren. All of a sudden, the Torah starts setting up a world that after the destruction that the flood wrought, you begin to see population around the world, or at least in some areas around the Middle and Near East. But the end of Parashat Noach, so again, we have not gotten to Abraham yet. The end of the parasha, we get 9 psukim, 9 verses of a story that really has nothing to do with Noach specifically or his family. As soon as this story is over, the Torah turns its attention once again to the descendants of Noach. Now, of course, the people in the story must be the descendants of Noach, because everyone in the Torah at this point is the descendant of Noach. But the story itself doesn't really concern Noach and his progeny, nor does it really concern us with how we get from Adam to Noach to Abraham, which is where the story is heading. So what happens in the story? Everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. Okay, that's a comfortable thought to get started with. And they migrated from the east, which is to say, if you're in the land of Israel, Canaan, and you go east of that place, you end up in what is now Iraq, and back then, sort of the lands of Sumer, Mesopotamia, and they came to the land of Shinar, and they settled there. Shinar is in what is modern-day Iraq. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them." Bricks serve them as stone, and bitumen serve them as mortar. This is kind of an interesting aside that's in the Torah itself. It's always interesting when the Torah has an aside. After the flood, right before the flood, when we learn about the descendants of Adam, the Torah makes a comment that one of Adam's descendants learned to use copper as a building material. The Torah is kind of fascinated by technology and what the descendants of the very first person God created could achieve. So in the 4th chapter of the book of Bereshit, there's a comment about the human mastery of copper. And here, 5 chapters later, is a comment about the mastery of making bricks. A technological achievement that one other culture in the Torah is actually going to comment on. And it's not Bnei Yisrael, the sons of Israel, it's actually the Egyptians. The word the Torah uses is levanim, bricks, as opposed to the Canaanite or Israelite technology of using stones. Anytime that Bnei Yisrael builds things in the Torah, until they get to the desert, they build them out of stones. Anytime that non-Bnei Yisrael people are building things in the Torah, up till this point, it's done with bricks. You sort of have the way the people who will become Jews build things, Jewish carpentry, and then you have everybody else's. And everybody else's seems a little bit more advanced. So the people of this place of Shinar said, "Come, let us build a city and a tower with its top in the sky to make a name for ourselves, else we be scattered all over the world." This is coming right after the story of Noah. Many years had passed, but there is a concern, there's a fear, there's an acknowledgement that what was once a singular family is now migrating, is now separating across the ancient Near East. And there's a fear that that scattering might happen to the people who left, I guess the West, ended up in the East. They don't want to leave this place between the Tigris and the Euphrates River that was lush, that had all of the things you needed to have the cradle of civilization. The Torah lets us imply or understand that they actually began building this, and God comes down, Adonai comes down to look at the city and the tower that humanity had built. And Adonai said, "If as one people, with one language for all, this is how they have begun to act, then nothing that they may propose to do will be out of their reach." Look at what these people have achieved. We should go down and we should inspect this thing, and Adonai seems almost afraid. Adonai comes down from on high. The word the Torah uses is vayered. Adonai comes down, lirot et ha'ir v'hamigdal, to look at the city and the tower. And then the Torah does that thing that it also does in Bereshit, the story of creation. Hava nerda, let us. Who is the us? God, with God's assembly of the same holy entities that God says in the creation story, let us create man in our image. Whoever the us is, this group, God and his posse, go down and they confound their speech, so that they shall not understand one another's speech. Thus Adonai scattered them from there over the face of the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babel, as in Babylon, because in the Hebrew, balal is to mix up, to confuse, to confound, which is a idiomatic play on the word Bavel. And from there, Adonai scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So what's the big deal? This is a technological achievement not that long after Noah built an ark at God's instruction to survive a flood. If anything, the people in this story are trying to achieve something that probably was family lore. Noah, the great patriarch, who communicated with God, who followed God's instruction to himself achieve a technological feat, building a boat that could withstand this great flood, they too wanted to make their mark in the world, to build something that would enable them to do that which their patriarch Noah had achieved. Now there's another story in the Torah. The Torah doesn't always love it when people take initiative. God likes to call the shots, and initiative is not always rewarded in the Torah. Can anybody think of a story in the Torah where initiative is quite literally not rewarded? There's a... Nadav and Avihu, Aaron's two sons, who take initiative to bring a sacrifice to God. They do something unusual in worshiping God that no one told them specifically to do. They bring an Eish Zara, they bring a strange fire, perhaps its own technological achievement, and as a result they get killed. Now, death isn't the punishment here, but here is a group of people seeking to achieve something to connect to God, who themselves are punished for taking the initiative. But as I said at the outset, if you just read the pshat, the simple explanation of the story, you are not necessarily left with a group of people who themselves are worthy of the pretty dramatic punishment that they receive. Now, the story that we get here is kind of interesting because it comes in chapter 11 of the Torah. But something happens in chapter 10 that sets this story up. You flip the page, you'll see two different things. First, you'll see a picture of, this is not Migdal Bavel. I'll explain what this picture is in just a moment. But we know that exactly one chapter earlier in the Torah, people already were speaking different languages. So here we have the story of Migdal Bavel, everyone speaking the same language. But the Torah has already set this up. In chapter 10 of Breshit, in describing the descendants of the three sons of Noach, the Torah says, Me'ela nirdefu iye hagoyim ba'artotam ish Leil shono lemishpechotam begoyehem. From these, the maritime nations branched out. These are referring to the descendants of Japhet. By their lands, each with its own language, their clans and their nations. Now, in English, we have the word language to describe a lot of different things. Sometimes language refers to people who speak the language, quite literally different languages. We have English, Spanish, Hebrew, etc. We also have language as dialect, people who come from the same place but speak differently, either regional or colloquialisms that are unique to a particular time or particular place. You can also have language that differs not necessarily based on dialect or region, but based on class. The upper class speak one way, the lower classes speak a different way. But in the Torah, in these stories, there are two different words that are used to describe language. In chapter 10, this little piece about the descendants of Japhet speaking different languages, these are lashon, which we sometimes translate literally as tongue. And in the story of Migdal Bavel, it uses the word safa, a different word for language. Why the difference? Why the distinction? And because there is such a distinction, or we have to understand that there is a distinction between these two things, because how could it be if people were already speaking different languages in chapter 10, in chapter 11, elsewhere, they're all speaking the exact same? Well, the Torah differentiates between three types of people. There are city folk, and city folk in the Torah are usually not the good guys in the stories. There's country folk, and the country folk tend to come from the land of Canaan or are shepherds, and those are usually the good guys in the story. And then there's a third group of people, the people who are water dwellers. There are not a lot of water dwellers in the Torah, but there are people who the Torah relegates to sort of existing in and among the coastlines of places. There are tribes of people who maybe lived off the land, but primarily were ship-based. And the midrash about the descendants of Japhet suggest that they were island dwellers. So perhaps there were people whose language, whose dialect developed so far away from everyone else because of their lack of proximity to others that they spoke a different lashon, a different tongue that may have been understandable to some but not to all. But at Migdal Bavel, they spoke one language, one safa, and that went away. The image before you. The story of Migdal Bavel, we don't always have historical evidence for stories from the Torah. And I can't tell you that this is a historically accurate photograph of Migdal Bavel, but what I can tell you is that throughout Mesopotamia and in the cultures that existed between the Tigris and the Euphrates, you have the construction of temples called ziggurats that were constructed as a way for the people who worshiped there to ascend quite literally to the heights of what they understood to be heavens to commune with God. So the creation of a ziggurat, and this is an image of one of the few existing ziggurats. Sadly, many of the ziggurats that actually were still around were destroyed by ISIS and or in fighting with ISIS. So up until the late aughts, you had a lot more ziggurats floating around the Levant and that part of the world than you have even today. But they are staired towers assembled with bricks to reach the heavens. They were attended to by a priestly class in Mesopotamia. It was a whole thing. And what's interesting about the ziggurats is that stelae or other ways in which Sumerian people wrote things down, they're all inscribed with the name of either the leader or the priest who was around for the construction of that ziggurat. So when the story tells us that they wanted to make for themselves a name, well, all the ziggurats have a name on them. So there is something that they were trying to achieve in this place that we know was going on at that time. And yet none of it seems all of that concerning until, just based on the pshat of the story, until you get into the drash, until you get into the explanation of what it is these people were doing. So, Rashi has a lot of thoughts on this story because Rashi, like many of the commentators, are grappling with what it is that is so distressing to God about what it is the people did in Shinar, what it is that these people did. So, they spoke Safa Echad. Rashi says, what language were they speaking? Oh, they're speaking Hebrew. That's an easy one. But then Rashi says, they spoke one language, and they also had Devarim Achadim. Not only did they have one language, they had one speech. They came with one plan. They came with one way of doing things. And each saying, he has no rights to select a heavenly region just for himself. We have a plan to go and fight a war with God. Let us build this ziggurat, this stairway, this way to ascend to God, and let us challenge him. Because we can. Because our technology, our human achievement, allows us to now go, for lack of a better way of saying it, toe-to-toe with God. And if you're going to go toe-to-toe with God, you got to get to God. And the only way to do that is to go up. Rashi suggests that as they went up, God comes down to see what it is that these people are doing. There's confusion, there's concern. And if these people are actually going to fight a war with God, God almost brings the fight to them in descending from on high. And interestingly, in this idea of the people of Shinar going to fight a war with God, God brings a crew. Because God speaks to a group that he brought with him in this interaction with the people. Rashi offers another explanation for Dvarim Achadim, is that they spoke Dvarim Chadim, sharp words, with them saying one in every 1,656 years, which is the time period between when man was created and the flood, there is a shaking, an earthquake, something trembling in the heavens, just as there was in the days of the flood. Come, let us give a reason for that in our generation. So Rashi grapples with this story and suggests a far more nefarious purpose to the building of Migdal Bavel. But the Ha'emek Davar, another commentator on this verse, suggests something slightly different. Here, the commentary suggests that it doesn't actually matter what it was that the people were saying. The Dvarim Achadim, the similar or same speech, that the Torah doesn't tell us what they said to each other, gives us a hint, but it doesn't actually matter because the Torah doesn't need to explain what it is, because the Torah isn't trying to teach us what they were doing, but rather that what they did caused sadness, caused distress, caused consternation to God. The words were what they were. And in the simplicity of the act, there is no sin. In fact, Ha'emek Davar says, on the contrary, in this story all appears well. But here what happened is that all thought the same thing. And this came to be the problem of the settlement at Shinar. It wasn't that the act itself was wrong or bad. It was that the total groupthink that came to dominate this group of people that would enable them, that would support their actions at Shinar, is what ultimately led to their downfall. Whether or not you subscribe to this way of thinking, this is sort of played out by the sort of contemporary theory of the tipping point. At what point does a critical mass of people get other people to simply go along with them, regardless of what that group is trying to achieve? Here, it's the tipping point to the extreme because every single person had bought into the idea. So what is it that actually happened? When God makes them speak differently and scatters them, what does it actually mean? Did Hashem pluck this group of people, wipe their brains and teach them French and send them over here, and wipe this group's people and teach them Akkadian and send them over there, and this one Aramaic, and etc.? Or was it something different? Reshit Rabbah picks up on this idea of what happened in this place. In what way were they scattered, and in what way were their speech changed? And Breshit Rabbah plays with the language a little bit. Remember that this is the story of Migdal Bavel. Bet, Lamed. Remember those letters. B, V, and L. And muddle, or in Hebrew, V'navla Sham Sfatam. Their language became muddled, Navla. Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana said, from their language, I will make them into Nevela, which is the Hebrew word for a dead body or a carcass. One of them would say to another, "Give me an axe," and he would give him a shovel. And he would then strike him and split his skull. That is what is written. From their language, I will make them into nevela. The Breshit Rabbah plays with the idea of what is it that actually occurred in transforming their language, in scattering them. It wasn't necessarily a physical scattering, and it wasn't necessarily, a brain wipe. It's the little nuances that exist between language. Breshit Rabbah in the tradition here suggests that God transformed the way in which people spoke to each other to the extent that each one put another in a state of peril. Asking for a shovel and getting an axe, asking for an axe and getting a shovel, asking for a sandwich and getting a cyanide pill. It's little things like that that pose real risk to people. So it wasn't necessarily, says Breshit Rabbah at least, that the people were completely removed from the place. It's rather that they became scattered from one another. That their ability to communicate, that their ability to do simple things like shovel dirt or cut down a tree began to pose such a risk one to the next that they had to separate from one another. That the scattering wasn't God plucking them and sending them here or there. It's that God destroyed the groupthink, and God also destroyed their ability to live in harmony near one another. There is harmony in Shinar. It's kind of idyllic. People all working together to achieve one common goal. But they went so all in on trying to achieve that one thing that God came down and put a stop to it. I think it's a hard story to grapple with because, on one hand, communal living and trying to achieve one goal, the pursuit of one thing, it seems very lofty. It seems very good. Lofty was not a pun, by the way. It is a lofty goal. But this story also points out the detriment that can come from one group of people trying to achieve one singular objective with a negative intent. There's a lot of good that can be done, and even sometimes things look very good at a surface level. But sometimes the things that look even good at a surface level, beneath those things lies a nefarious or malintent. And the story of Migdal Bavel reminds us to be mindful of even things that at surface level look very good, because it can lead us down some seriously concerning paths. Chag Sameach to all.
Thank you, Sam. Folks, I know the hour is late. We want to go to 11:30 today. Do people have in them to stay for another 23 minutes? And I will finish at 11:30. Do people have it in it to stay? Well, I'm going to start, and I won't be offended if people walk out. But really, we're going to finish on time at 11:30, not like Arthur Wiener 11:30, but like an objective 11:30. So if you'd like to stay, we're going to stay, and if you are not, grab some to eat on the way out. All right, the more we eat, the less we go. I want to say a few words tonight about the Jewish calendar. We talk about it. We all know a little bit about it, and I want to say a few words about it that we don't often talk about. I want to deal with the lunar calendar, the solar calendar, and how it goes into the calendar of the Jewish year as we understand it. And I suspect that everything I say, of all I'm going to say in the next 20 minutes, some of it is going to be familiar to everybody, but hopefully we'll add a few things tonight that you were not aware of, and will add to your understanding of this amazing document, this amazing tool, the Jewish calendar. Now, you all know that and you've heard me say this before, I love the Jewish calendar because it's one of the last things we have in Judaism that pulled us all together. One of the last things we have. Don't care what everybody's doing on Purim, but we all celebrate Purim on the same day. Right? We all begin Passover on the same day, and so on and so forth. We have a basic dilemma in the Jewish calendar. What is it? The Jewish calendar is an amalgam of a lunar calendar that nonetheless has to stay in sync with the solar calendar. How long is a lunar month? Approximately 29 and a half days, which is why one Rosh Chodesh one Hebrew month is 30 days, followed by another which is 29 days. A solar calendar is approximately 365 days, based on 365 days. Now, these calendars can exist in separate realms. You can have a lunar calendar and you can have a solar calendar, except for when the calendars have to work together. Why would a calendar have to work together? We have a tradition that says that Passover comes in the spring. That Passover is observed in Chodesh Aviv. You ever wonder why sometimes Passover feels like it's early or it's late, or conversely, this year, mercifully, high holidays are about as late as they can possibly be relative to the solar calendar? It has to do with the need to make sure that our holidays, each of which has an agricultural dimension, are celebrated in their agricultural season. If you ran a straight lunar calendar, the holidays would cycle through the solar year. It's why sometimes, let's say, the example of a purely lunar calendar that you're all familiar with is the Islamic calendar, which is why every couple of years, Ramadan, I mentioned that because that's probably the most famous of the months of the Islamic calendar, is in the winter, then it's in the spring, then it's in the summer, then it's in the fall. Because it doesn't have to be balanced or reckoned with a solar calendar. And the Torah says, for example, that Passover must be celebrated in the spring. Indeed, one of the names of Passover is Chag Aviv, right? The holiday that comes around springtime. So again, in the solar calendar, we have probably 365 and a quarter days, while a lunar year of 12 months is approximately 354 days. So already they're imbalanced. How do we fix the imbalance relative to the rotation of the Earth around the Sun in the solar year? we add a leap day every 4 years. In Hebrew, in the Hebrew calendar, I'm sorry, if we're trying to juxtapose the lunar calendar, if we're trying to keep the lunar and the solar calendars aligned, in the Hebrew calendar we add an extra month, the leap month. This is done every 2 or 3 years to compensate for the whole month our calendar falls behind the civil calendar in the course of every 3 years. Remember, we lose approximately 11 days every 3 years. That's why we add the entire month. And we insert this leap year, this 13th month, into our calendar after Adar, which is the 12th month of the year. What does it mean that it's the 12th month of the year? According to the Torah, what's the first month of the year? Nisan. Okay? We're used to thinking it's Tishrei because of the high holidays. But the Torah says that Nisan, it will be the first of months to you, making Adar the last of the month, the 12th of the month. So the extra month that's tossed in, the leap month, has become to be known Adar Sheni, literally the second Adar. And this name was originally, the name of this month was, originally there was no name for this month, it was just added in, but later, in the Mishnah, we begin to see it referred to as Adar Sheni. We need to understand that until the 4th century, there was no fixed Jewish calendar. How did we know when months came and went? Anybody remember? We looked at the moon, but not just anybody. Theoretically, the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem would literally query witnesses to make sure they had seen the moon. And then, once having determined that the new moon had begun, they would send literally runners and messages and even smoke signals to different communities, let them know that the month had began. Indeed, in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, a very dramatic moment takes place. The story of a very dramatic moment takes place in the time of the Tanaim, of the sages of the Mishnah, where the greatest rabbis of the generation could not agree on the calendar, and there were 2 different opinions on whether Yom Kippur, what the correct day for the observance of Yom Kippur was. So in the 4th century, after many years of Roman persecution, so if you recall in a little history, terrible persecution of the Jewish people during and after the destruction of the Second Temple. Things got better, things got worse. After the period of the Bar Kokhba revolt, tremendous, the real exile of the Jewish people began. And tremendous suffering on and off for several centuries after that, until in the middle of the 4th century, the decision was made that the calendar would be fixed for all time. We would no longer rely on the sighting of the new moon and the sending of messengers throughout. But a fixed calendar would be established, one that's worked out pretty well, one that still guides us to this very, very day. And they did this without a slide rule, a computer, even a ballpoint pen. They figured it all out. Now, our teacher, I say our teacher, mine and Rabbi Kogan's, Rabbi David Golinkin, one of tremendous scholar in Israel, proved recently that even though historians basically say the calendar was affixed in the middle of the 4th century, they found evidence in the Cairo Geniza. Are you all familiar with what the Cairo Geniza is? The repository of medieval Jewish, of early medieval materials, that the actual fixing of the calendar actually went on, off and on, to almost the middle of the 9th century. So the basics were laid out in the middle of the 4th century, but the process went on and off for hundreds of years afterwards to give us the calendar that we know now, which includes a system of 19 years, of which 7 of those 19 years are a leap year. And that's what accounts for sometimes Passover at the very end of March or early April, or like this year when it was much later in April, or why sometimes the high holidays are right after Labor Day. Or remember one year, a couple of years ago, it was on Labor Day. That really annoyed you. Okay? And this year, as I said, mercifully, I think the first day of Rosh Hashanah is October 2nd, October 3rd, which is almost as late as possible relative to the solar calendar. The leap year, I'm sorry, the intercalculated years, let me go back a second. I'm rushing because I don't want to, I want to keep everyone on time tonight. We have a 19-year cycle, of which, like I said, 7 of those years are going to be leap years. Right now, and here's the part that you probably don't know. I got to leave you something new to go home. When did our 19-year cycle begin? The one that we are currently in. Anybody know? Anybody? I was asked this recently. I didn't know the answer. That's one of the reasons why I started to talk about this for the Tikkun tonight. Somebody asked me recently, Rabbi, I heard we're in this 19-year cycle. When did our year cycle begin? I said, I didn't know. I had to look it up. Our 19-year cycle began in the year 5777, which was to the what we would call 2016/2017. That Jewish year. So right now we're in 5784, which is the 8th year of the 19-year cycle. The 8th year of the 19-year cycle. In the intercalculated years, we call here the Shana Uberet, the leap year will always be in the 19-year cycle, year 3, year 6, year 8, which I just said the year that we're in, 11, 14, 17, and 19. Every 19-year cycle will work in that particular fashion. Okay, 3, by the way, this will be on the final, okay? 3, 6, 8, 11, 14, 17, and 19. That's why this is a leap year. Now, in the Bible, let's say something about the months, okay? We're going to finish on time tonight, okay? In the Bible, how are the months referred to? I want you to think back. How are the months referred to in the Bible? Anybody know? Certainly. But most of the time, the months are referred to like, the first month, month 1, month 2, month 3, month 4. You're feeling yourself, aren't you? Good for you, okay? Okay. But even as the Torah generally refers to the months, especially the months that have the holidays in them, by a number, first month, the fourth month, or this month, that month, there are several months that are mentioned in the Bible by their early Canaanite names, including Aviv, which is month number 1, Nisan, which we know now as Nisan. Ziv, the book of Kings refers to this as the second month. Etanim, also from the book of Kings, which is the 7th month. And a reference in 1 Kings to Bul, which is the 8th month. But we know the names of the months from the, well, we know them because they're out there. We just print them here on the board so I can remember them. And I can think to myself, oh my God, 8 months to high holidays, 4 months to high holidays, 1 month to high holidays, okay? The names for the months that we have today are remnants of the great exile after the destruction of the first temple in Bavel. I mean, not my son's Bavel, all right? The good Bavel, the good Bavel, Babylonia. And they brought back with them the names from the Babylonian calendar, which included the names of the months, as well as the tradition of a 19-year cycle for intercalculating the leap years. And the Talmud Yerushalmi says, Rabbi Hanina said, they brought back with them from Bavel, from Babylonia, the names of the months. And we know what the original names were. Nisanu became Nisan. Ayaru, Iyar. Simanu, Sivan. Deuzu, Tammuz. Abu, Av. We see a little bit of a Hebraization of these foreign words into the months that we're familiar with today. Tashritu is Tishrei, Arachsamu becomes Mar Cheshvan, Tabetu Tevet, Shabbatu Shvat, and Adaru, Adar. So again, the Jewish people, the Jews brought back the Babylonian names of the months, but they did not adopt the Babylonian calendar that they had been used to for several generations. In the Babylonian calendar, most of the leap years added a second Adaru, or we would call a second Adar. But in the 17th year of the cycle, they added a second Elul, or Elul. And we have some references to this in various parts of the Talmud in Masechet Rosh Hashanah. And there the Talmud states that in the name of Rabbi Hanina ben Bar Kahana, from the days of Ezra and onward, we have not found Elul to be intercalculated. Meaning at one point, they likely followed this larger Babylonian scheme, but after they returned to the land of Israel, they ceased to do that and continued only to add the leap year in at this season of the year. Indeed, there's another statement from Masechet Sanhedrin that says, we do not intercalculate the year before Rosh Hashanah, meaning we don't add the extra month in before Elul, or after Elul. In other words, even though they adopted or influenced by the Babylonian calendar and add 7 leap years in a 19-year cycle, we only add second Adar and not second Elul like the Babylonians. And I close with this point. Now, some of you may find this surprising. Why would we have borrowed the calendar from the Babylonians? Well, the practical reason was it was a working calendar, a tradition of which helped the Jewish people maintain the calendar amidst the Roman persecution, which prevented the calculating of the calendar in what we'll call the traditional or time-honored fashion. Everybody got that? It's very easy to work the calendar when the Romans aren't chasing you around the land with an axe.